Hey everybody, and welcome to my second of two videos about the Minolta SRT 101. In this video we're going to look at what the parts are and what they do. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about mounting and unmounting a lens. And it's pretty simple to do. You just push this button towards the base of the camera and rotate the lens counter or anti-clockwise to remove it. There we go. Mounting the lens is similarly simple. You can see there's a red dot right here. Well, on the lenses there is a red dot right here. Line up the two red dots and rotate, and you've mounted the lens. So that's how you would change lenses. Next thing we're going to do is load and unload film. So to load the film, first you have to open the film back, which you do by lifting up on the door. And on this one, at least, you've got to pry the door open. It is supposed to just spring up, but this one does not like to do that. So next you're going to take the 35mm film cassette and put it into the cassette chamber and put the film advance knob back in place. I'm going to activate the shutter because we're going to have to advance the film. When you activate the shutter, make sure that the film leader and your finger are away from the shutter curtains. Pull out a film leader. I'm going to feed it right in there. There we go. It's going to go right in there, and make sure that the sprocket holes are lined up with the sprocket. There we go. And do one more for good measure. That film's going to advance. So what we're going to do is we're going to close the film back. We're going to remind ourselves of what the ISO is. We're going to call this ISO 100. Why not? We're going to set this to ISO 100. We're going to take the slack out of the film and then advance it to the first frame. And you know it's advancing correctly if the film rewind knob turns while you're advancing the film. So one thing to bear in mind when you do film photography is that film is one and done. If it is exposed to light, it cannot take another image. So once you have your film back closed, it has to stay closed until you've used all of the film in the cassette, wound it up to this side, and then completely rewound it. To rewind it, you would hold this button down, or push it in rather, and then rewind the film. But we're not there just yet. Instead, now remember, don't do this with your film for real images because it will erase every image on the film. I'm going to show you what happens inside the camera when you advance and rewind the film. So after you take a picture, you advance the film, and the film take-up spool pulls it through here, and the sprocket guides it in. These four knobs, as you can see, help keep it lined up properly, and the two inner guide rails, when the pressure plate is up against them, help to keep the film flat so that the image can focus properly on it. So let's say you've gone through your entire roll of film. Okay, you've kept your film back closed the whole time. You've gone through your entire roll of film. Now you're going to rewind it. You do that by pushing in the film rewind button, rewinding your film like this. But I'm going to show you what happens when you rewind your film so that you get a better sense of it. Now remember, you cannot open your camera back until the film is completely rewound into the cassette. But this is what happens when you rewind the film. Now listen for this sound as you rewind it. That sound is the sound of the leader coming off of the take-up spool. And that's the sound that lets you know you're almost done. Also, likewise, if that sound happens after you've cranked the film twice, then it didn't actually go through the camera. But that doesn't happen often. For real photography, you would want to take the leader all the way back into the cassette, but I'm going to use that for other videos, so I won't. Then you would either call it a night or put your next roll of film in. So the next thing that we're going to do is change the battery. Now, a quick note on batteries. This uses the old Mercury style batteries. Those batteries looked like this. This is the proper shape and size. This is an Li 560. PX 625 is another kind of battery that's like this. They are, however, both 1.5 volt batteries and will not work in this camera. The light meter will not read correctly. So there are two things you can do. You can either use one of these and compensate, and I'll show you how to do that. So this has a very easily removed battery cover. Don't even need a coin for it. It usually just unscrews by itself. It's incredibly well designed. So after you open up the battery chamber, now you have to know how to load the battery. So here is the marking on the battery chamber. As we can see from our adapted battery, it has that shape, which means that this part that you're looking at right now has to contact that springy bit, which is inside the camera. Here's that springy bit. So that's what the camera looks like, or that's what the battery looks like when it goes in. The positive terminal faces upward. This should go on very easily. If your battery cover fights you, make sure it's not cross-threaded. Back it up and try to put it on. It should screw on very quickly and simply. If you're using one of the PX625s, the meter will not be accurate. So here's what you need to do to calibrate the meter and find out how much it is off. First, set your aperture to f16. Next, when you have a sunny day, go out and find a subject in full sunlight. Set your ISO to your film speed, whatever film speed it is you want to use, whether it's the rated speed or if you're going to push and pull. And set your shutter to that speed as well, or to the closest setting of that speed. Now what's going to happen is, according to the Sunny 16 rule, 100 ISO at 1/125th of a second at f16 with an object in full sun is a proper exposure. Your light meter is going to tell you it's not. It should tell you that it's 2 stops underexposed. But what you'll do is you'll adjust your ISO dial until you find the correct setting. But this is the trick. Use the Sunny 16 rule and use your ASA dial to adapt to the proper exposure setting. Once you've loaded your battery, you also want to check it. And here's the battery check. So you turn it to battery check, and what will happen is that in the viewfinder, but when you switch it to battery check, you see how the needle is in that block right there? That tells you that the battery is good, but actually kind of on its last legs. It's almost out of charge. The needle should be in the middle of that block. But as long as it's in that block, the meter reading will be accurate. So let's talk a little bit about using the flash. Here is an accessory shoe. It is not a flash hot shoe. You could put a flash in it, but the camera won't be able to power it directly. So you need a cable going from your flash to the X-Sync on the front of your camera there. As you can see on the shutter speed dial, it has a 1/60th of a second in red. That is the maximum shutter speed, the fastest shutter speed you can use, and use the flash to get a full image. Now the reason that happens is, let's say that this is the image you're going to take a flash photo of. What happens at 1/60th of a second is you have your 2 shutter curtains. Okay? First one opens up, flash, and the second one closes. At 1/125th of a second, the first one opens. Well, the second one's going to come through fairly quickly, because the shutter speed isn't increased by the shutter curtains moving faster, but by the amount of space between the shutter curtains. So at 1/125th of a second, flash, well, you're going to have dark areas where the shutter curtain blocked the light from reaching the film. At 1/30th of a second, they'll be open the whole time, but for slightly longer than at 1/60th. And the same thing at a full second, let's say, they'll be open for quite a long time, and then we'll come back and close and cut off the light to the film again. And then when you advance the film, they go back like that. So the faster shutter speeds in the 60th of a second, that's telling you that the curtains aren't completely open and allowing light to the entire film plane at once at any point during that shutter speed setting. Okay, so we've got all the basics down. Next thing we're going to do is look through this camera's viewfinder. Over on the right is your light meter. And what that's telling you is that you do not right now have a proper exposure. So by adjusting the aperture ring, you're going to move the match needle until, and the shutter speed as well, you're going to move the match needle until it is at proper exposure, and that's what that looks like right there. Along the bottom, you can see it's telling you what your shutter speed is, and that's helpful because you don't want to have a shutter speed that's going to induce camera shake. So with a normal lens, if you're at 1/30th or below, you risk camera shake. So here's the rest of the focusing screen. You have a central collar with a microprism focusing grid in the center. And then other than that, it's pretty much wide open without a whole lot to distract you. The triangles indicate your total exposure range from minimum exposure up to maximum exposure, and that's how much light the camera can actually see. So it's a pretty nice focusing screen, very easy to use, very bright. And as you've seen, the focusing screen is also much simpler than a modern camera's screen. It doesn't have all the lines and the blinking lights and the LEDs. It just tells you what you need to know in order to take a good photo. So, with that in mind, let's talk about how to take a photo with this camera. First thing that you're going to do is sight up your subject through the viewfinder and focus until you have the proper focus. There we go. Spot on focus. Now that you have your subject in focus, we're going to use the aperture ring and shutter speed dial to get the ideal setting. Okay, so f5.6 at 1/125th looks pretty good. If I wanted to, I could go down to f2.8, which is 2 stops, and f500. So how you want your image to look with a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field is up to you, and you have a lot of creative control with this camera. After you have all of your settings done, you take the picture and advance it, and that is all there is to taking a picture with this camera. We've just taken a picture with this camera. How do we take a double exposure with this camera? Well, let's go back to our settings, f5.6 and 1/125th of a second. Okay, so we know that that's the correct meter reading, but we want to take a double exposure. So the first thing we've got to do is cut the amount of light in half. We want to use the shutter speed because using the aperture will change the depth of field, and more likely with a double exposure the depth of field is more important than the shutter speed. So next we're going to take the picture, we're going to take the slack out of the film, and basically you just want to rotate this until you get resistance. Okay, and you can leave it open, sometimes that helps, because you're going to have to hold this, you're going to have to depress the film rewind button and advance the film. Next, you take your next image, and then you advance your film. But you're not done yet. After you've taken your double exposure, you've got to put the lens cap back on the camera and then take a dead frame. And the reason that you take a dead frame is because when you take a double exposure, you're basically forcing the camera not to advance the film, and you're taking it out of sequence for how it interprets the registration. So to bring it back, and so what happens is when it advances the double exposure, it's not going to advance at the full frame. So you take the dead frame after the double exposure so that you can advance the double exposure and get the frame counting back in line as it's supposed to be. If you don't take a dead frame, you risk your double exposure only advancing part way, and then your next frame overlapping the double exposure and both of the shots being ruined. How old is your SRT 101? And I mentioned before that the MLU button is an indicator of being pre or post 72, but that might not be 100% correct because the MLU started being phased out in generation 1 of these, and they finished phasing it out in generation 3. There were at least three distinct generations in the SRT 101. So it's not a perfect indicator of how old your camera was, but there are some design differences that exist that are indicators. Now I will tell you right now, both of these cameras are of the same generation, so I'm going to set this guy off to the side here. We'll take a look at this other one. because it doesn't have a social security number on it, and it's easier to see some of the differences in it. From 1966 until 1969, the shutter speed dial right here had fine knurls on it, and all of the screws on the back, right here and here and here, were wedge head screws, not Phillips head screws. So this has Phillips head screws, and it has a coarse dial on that, so I know it's later than 1969. From 1966 until 1967, the screws on the back here are equidistant from the viewfinder eyepiece. So I already know that this is later than 69, but if these were wedge head and this had a fine knurl, if these two screws were the same distance, it would be from 66 or 67. If they are spaced like this one is, it would be from 68 or 69. From 1966 until 1968, all SRT 101 bodies are chrome, meaning if you have a black copy of an SRT 101, it is from 1969 or later. From 1968 onward, the screws on the sides above the lens mount are visible. These are these screws right here. There's a screw, and there is a screw. So those are visible, meaning that this is from 1968 or later. Well, we already know because of the shutter speed dial, it's from later than 1969, but if yours has a fine knurl and visible screws, then it is from 68 or 69. From 1970 to 73, these had a coarse ridge chrome shutter speed dial. That's this one right here. This is from 70 to 73. Actually, I think through the end of the production they had this type of coarse dial on the shutter count window, or I'm sorry, on the shutter speed dial. From 1972 onward, the frame count window above the serial number was held in place with glue and not a bracket. I can't really show you what that looks like because in order to tell that, you've got to take it apart. From 1973 to 1975, this metal peg at the front of this accessory shoe was replaced with a lip formed by the black plastic base that it rests on. So what I know about this camera is that it's later than 1969 because of the knurls. Same thing with my other SRT 101. But it is older than 1970 because of the metal peg, which means that it was made in 1969. Both of these cameras that I have were made in 1969. So that is it for the Minolta SRT 101. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section below. If you'd like to subscribe, you can do that. And when you subscribe, YouTube will let you know when I have more camera and film photography related videos. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, please let me know, and if I have the equipment and technical know-how, I'm more than happy to make those for you. If you are an amateur photographer and have taken photos with an SRT 101 and would like to share those, feel free to put a link to them in the comments section. If this video was helpful, please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know I'm on the right track. One last thing. Thank you guys for watching, and take great photos.